All right. So this session is about scaffolding and scheduling group projects using an Agile framework. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been doing in my classes in this vein. But before we jump totally in, I'm going to talk a little bit about some Agile frameworks. Agile is really a process, and the way that I've come to it is through design. So usually through an Agile design process, which is really just a process that's meant to be really efficient and puts a lot of control in a big project to individual small teams. So the people who are working on the project, rather than like a top-down approach, it's more of a bottom-up approach to kind of project management. And usually one of the features of something that's Agile is that they produce products very quickly and rapidly and continue to improve those products over time. So rather than working on something for a really, really, really long time, hoping that you're going to end up with something perfect at the end, you actually output and like publish something pretty frequently and iterate on that. And that stuff is often public and just continues to improve over time. And so it's something that like maybe doesn't have a specific total endpoint, but you're kind of continually working on something. So two frameworks that tend to be common when you look up kind of Agile processes is Kanban or Kanban. And I don't actually know which way is the correct way of pronouncing it because you hear both pronunciations, which is really something that looks very similar to the image that's on the left. It's kind of a 3-column approach. Sometimes it's more with a kind of a to-do list, things that are in progress, and then things that are done. And so it's a project management kind of strategy. And then there's also something called a Scrum. And you might have heard something like using design sprints or doing things in sprints, which are usually 2 to 3 weeks, some sort of short period of time that's a designated amount of time, where at the end of that time period, something very specific will have been accomplished. So if you're building a piece of software, it might be a particular feature of that software that's done. If you're working on a different kind of project, it might be just a particular part of the product that's finished. If you're working on a book, maybe be finished with a chapter or something. So if we dive a little bit deeper into the Kanban like strategy here, there's a couple of different features that are common when using that particular framework. One is having a backlog, and that's the idea of having a complete list of all of the possible things you might do on a project, like in its entirety, even things that are maybe like stretch goals that you may or may not get to. Then you have this cards and columns strategy, which you see on the screen here. This one happens to have 4 columns where there's an idea column, which is similar to the backlog, to do, things that are in progress, and things that are done. And you move things from column to column as you move forward in a process. So it's a way to visualize where you are in a project. So I can add a bunch of things that I need to do. And as I start working on them, I can move them into doing. And then when I'm done with them, I move them to the done category. And if you want to use a board like this to kind of organize your time, then you often want to put a work in progress limit so that you don't end up with too many things in the doing column. You want to make sure that you're reducing the amount of time of things that go from like to do to done, right? So that time period you want to reduce as much as possible. So you want to only have a few things in the doing column at one time. This particular strategy is pretty flexible because it's fluid. Things can get added to the to-do list. They can go into the doing list. You can also have things that are on the to-do list that go back to the idea list that you might get to at another time that aren't a priority anymore. There are a lot of places where you can get digital boards to help you organize this sort of thing. Prior to COVID and having to do a lot of things virtually, people would do this on physical boards. You might have a board in your office if you're managing your own projects, or students might have boards in a classroom. What's really convenient, though, is if students are collaborating, there's a lot of platforms to do this virtually as well. Some options include Trello, which you can use for free, and you can also make templates for students. So that can be really helpful. That new app that is in pilot for this spring semester called Circle In does have these boards built in for individual students. that they can use. And there's also a tool called Miro, which is like a whiteboard app that has some of this, this board capability built into it as well. And there's plenty of others as well if you just search Kanban. The other common framework is called Scrum. And projects that are done with Scrum have some very specific kind of deliverables or moments in the process that exist, and they're pretty consistent. Scrum is a little more rigid of a structure than Kanban. And it usually starts with a sprint plan, which would outline the very specific goals that you're going to accomplish in a very short amount of time that you're going to work on a project. It includes a backlog, just like the Kanban strategy does. So there's a list of kind of potential things to do, detailed out. So like one thing per card, essentially. Usually this means we're working in a team, and it would include something called a daily scrum or a daily huddle, where everybody or sometimes you might hear this as a stand-up meeting. These are often, if it's in a workplace, might be early in the day, and people generally check in with their small team that they're working with and answer kind of the following questions. What did you work on yesterday? What are you going to work on today? And is there anything kind of getting in your way of getting that done, as a way for everybody in a team to know what's going on? Sometimes teams do this once a week or what have you. In my classes, I was doing it once a class, and I was doing it in a written format instead of a spoken format. Then there's the sprint itself, which is a short period of time to work on something. And then there's a sprint review, which is where you kind of do a show and tell of your work to maybe other teams that you might be collaborating with in a class setting. It might be one team presenting to the rest of the class about where they're at on a project. And then finally, at the end of each sprint, there's something called a retrospective. And that's a way to kind of check in more about the process than the actual product that you're creating. So on the bottom left of this screen, you can see an example of a potential digital version of a retrospective, where you might ask the team to reflect on how the team has been working together with questions like, what should the team start doing? What should the team stop doing? And what should the team continue doing? You can do this in a way where it's maybe timed, and people, write some things on a sticky note, add them to the board quietly, and then talk about it as a group. And then that way, everybody has an opportunity to contribute to the conversation about how the team has been going. But then the whole group can also see patterns and things as well. In my particular use of an agile method, I used a mix of those two methods, right? So I had sprints in place, but I also was using kind of some Kanban boards as well to organize students. So in my web design class, I use this methodology. I've used it in some other classes as well. And what it looked like for my class was, at the very beginning of the semester, after the add drop period was over, I always wait until that moment. I form teams, and then I have them do an activity together that's really low stakes so that they can get to know each other, have fun, and it's usually competitive. So in this case, I had them design an emoji that they could use in the communication tool we were using. And in this class, we were using Slack, which is kind of a messaging application. And if you're interested in more information about that, I have a workshop on that next week. So they designed that first. That was a way to get to know each other, have a little fun. Then they kind of established some team agreements about how they were going to communicate, how quickly they were going to communicate, ways that they were going to be respectful of one another and one another's time. And then essentially what I did was organize the semester around the idea of sprints. So they were learning how to code a website from scratch, and their assignment together was to build a website from scratch, right? So I broke that project down into multiple little sprints, or little kind of snacks that they could have and like complete something in its entirety by the end of that sprint. One of the things that worked really well for me, though, is that instead of doing sprints back to back, maybe at the end of the semester, which is kind of the way that I may have done some things previously, where I might put a lot of new material learning at the beginning of the semester, and at the end of the semester, we might work on a project for 5 weeks or something. Instead, I integrated it throughout the entire semester, where I might introduce new material for a week or two and then have a sprint for a week or two, and that's all the students are doing in class. And then introduce new material and do some exercises again, and then another sprint. What worked really well about this like weaved strategy is that when the students weren't in sprint mode, they were maybe doing some tutorials, exercises, learning some new things, readings, etc. And I was able to go in and look at the work that they did during the sprint and give them some really detailed feedback about where they were at, so that when they started the next sprint, they could revise things related to their first sprint before moving on. And that ability to give that feedback before they did the next step of essentially what is scaffolding was really helpful, because they had detailed feedback before they started the next step. So sometimes if you're thinking about like a research paper or something, you might think of steps like a thesis statement and then a rough draft or whatever. A sprint might break it down into different kinds of steps. So for example, in my web class, I had students put together their entire website in the very first sprint in terms of just text. It wasn't formatted, it wasn't really visually designed, but they had to put all the content together and make it so that it worked. You could click from one page to another. And so that in and of itself was something that was working and complete. It wasn't ideal, but it was a version that was working and complete. And then the next time they spent time working on their typography and the formatting, and then they mixed in images and media and then animations and things like that towards the end. So what you want to think about in terms of sprints is that each sprint has a very clear goal and a very clear kind of end deliverable of what you're trying to accomplish. I had students use kind of a Kanban board for each sprint, so they knew kind of what they needed to work on or what they needed to accomplish by the end of the sprint. They were working on their own ideas and things, so not everything on their to-do list were the same, right? Because they were doing different projects. They could add in some to-dos that were related to revisions from the previous sprint. And then during their sprints, they would do these daily huddles, and we did them in Slack, as I mentioned before, where they would, at the beginning of class, before class started, post what they had done since last class, what they planned on working on during class, and then any barriers that they were facing. And so sometimes that was because someone else, they were waiting on something from another team member, or it might be because they had technical issues or whatever. And because that was in a place where I could see it as well as their team members and my TA, we could help resolve that issue during class. And during the sprint times, we used our entire class period to work collaboratively, and I wasn't introducing new content. Then we would do basically presentations on kind of our progress as a sprint review, moving into a week of new material. And then they would also have reflections at the end of each sprint that asked them kind of what they accomplished, what they were proud of, and things like that, as well as kind of how the team dynamics were working. Some of the tools that I used to make this happen include communication tools. So I use Slack for asynchronous communication and some chat kind of during class and during work time. That was also a place where the TA and I provided some technical support. And then we also use Zoom breakouts pretty frequently. Sometimes the students set up their own Zoom meetings and their own kind of breakouts. And then sometimes I would set it up and I just had kind of standard breakouts. They were in the same teams consistently, persistently through the semester. And I would set those out and they would go work, and I would drop into different groups and see how things were going. For project management, you could use something like Trello or Miro. And then for file management, because they're working on collaborative files, you could use something like Google Drive, or if it's mostly brainstorming and other kinds of materials like that, where a whiteboard might be helpful, then Miro might be a good option. If you're interested in some of the whiteboarding kind of components of this, because a lot of the slides that I was showing you, like this one, for example, these are all things that I did in a whiteboarding app, this one as well. I have a session on that right after this. So I kept it open so that I would end up with about 5 minutes of questions, so I'm right on time. Does anyone have any questions about what Agile is or ways that they might be able to use it in their class? I'll invite you to unmute yourself.
I have a relatively simple question.
Sure.
So is I'm assuming that you assign the groups at the very beginning of class and they stay consistent then throughout all the different sprints? Is
Yes,
that,
that's how I set it up because they were working on one project together persistently for the semester.
and just out of a curiosity, do you assign groups or do you let them pick their own?
I assign them. And the reason why I assign them is that I intentionally pick folks that are maybe from different majors or with different skill sets to work together, because they're designing websites from scratch. And I do happen to get different majors in my classes. So I make sure they have a designer on them. You know, if I have someone from human computer interaction or more of a computer scientist, you know, or a marketing student, I try to kind of mix those students together.
And that's my last question then. Do they, I guess I have a lot of questions actually. Do they all get the same grades at the end of the sprints or do you grade them differently?
I don't provide like grades that land in the grade book permanently after a sprint. Like the feedback that I give after a sprint is about revision, and really the idea that sprints are about iteration and revising. So the grade for the project isn't really established until the end, mostly because students are able to significantly improve over the course of the semester. And what have you. And no, the students don't all get the same grade because the project itself gets the same grade, but there are components that individuals have to do separately, that are graded separately. So their final grades for the project are not the same. But that does lead to an important clarification that I did not mention earlier, which is that in the Scrum kind of method, there are usually very defined roles for each person during a sprint. Whereas in the kind of Kanban strategy, people kind of just sort that out and assign as things get in the to-do list, they get assigned to people. So it's slightly more flexible. So the way that I approach it is kind of in the middle of the two.
Rebecca, this is Kate.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. So can these formats or ways of approaching this projects be applied in individual? I know not all of them can, you know, but could you use them in individual projects or no?
You can. I think that the kind of Kanban boards like work really well for that particular situation when it's an individual project because it's a little more fluid. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't necessarily strategize and set things up in a sprint kind of formula for students because it helps organize their time and helps them have very specific goals at specific moments in time. And it helps them see a product really quickly.
Maybe too, they could Scrum and talk about their progress or things that they're working on to bounce off ideas or to, you know, help encourage those that may be not grasping the concepts or, you know, the project or maybe not making progress. They can hear kind of what the others are doing. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I experimented with that a little bit in my advanced design class. And what I found is like it was helpful for me because I had them do like those daily huddles or those daily updates each class period, so I knew where they were at with a project, and so did their the cohort of other students that were also kind of with them. They're like little critique groups. But I did find that it was a little harder to get students to be invested in that process if they weren't all working on the same project.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I would encourage like, you know, grading the feedback or grading like some of the components of having to interact with one another if they're not working on the same project. That's what I learned.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? We have like another minute or so left. All right. Well, thanks for your time and attention. Hopefully it gave you a little taste of it, maybe a method that you haven't heard of before that you can dig a little deeper into. And I'd encourage you to stick around if you're interested in this method for the whiteboard session at 3:30 because I could not do an agile method without having ample whiteboards.